Hello, everyone. Faron Manuel here. I'm an independent curator out of Atlanta, Georgia. I collaborated with Black Art in America for a special exhibition in conjunction with the March on Washington Film Festival. This year's film festival's theme is praising the bridges, celebrating women who contributed to the civil rights movement and the March on Washington. So, in honor of this year's festival, we've put together a special exhibition of works by women artists, by African American women artists, called "Praising the Bridges." Called "Our Image is Our Message." Excuse me. So the exhibit is called "Our Image is Our Message," as told by Black women artists, and it's featuring some legacy artists like Elizabeth Catlett, Samela Lewis, Faith Ringo, in conversation with some more contemporary artists like Evita Tizino, Lavette Ballard, Delita Martin, and we also have some works by Lynn Marshall Linnemeyer in the show. So, and I'm here in conversation with another curator who's based here in DC, Deirdre Darden. She's an independent curator, and she's also the curator of the permanent collection here at the Eaton Hotel in DC. So,
thanks for having me. I walked in at the right moment, I guess.
Right. Like, how often does another curator walk into the room?
Right.
Like, this is a setup.
Yeah.
So yeah, pretty much in the show, we have a grouping of works by women artists, and something I noticed just once I was presented with a group of about 40 works to choose from and to come up with an exhibition theme. Najee Dorsey, the founder of Black Art in America, called me, and he just mentioned that he had a project he figured I'd be perfect for. Mm-hmm. And he said that it's a show of works by women artists. I looked over it. I came up with some concepts and some themes, and really the works kind of came up with the themes for me in a way.
Yeah.
So
it happens that way sometimes.
It was like I noticed that a lot of these artists, these women, were saying some of the same things in their work. They were grappling with some of the same issues. Yeah. And the works in the show cover a period of 40 years. So they were created within the last 40 years. And I looked at the works from the legacy artists, and I saw that they were dealing with issues of politics in America, racial politics. They were also dealing with issues of identity and affirming themselves as women. And another thing they were dealing with were just notions of freedom, or images of Black people in positions in life where they were self-satisfied. Yeah. So a portrait, or it could be a group of people just looking content with their situation. And I noticed these same themes in the works of the contemporary artists. And these things are just really long-standing questions and ideas that Black women artists have been grappling with over the years. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, for me as a curator and a Black woman, a lot of the work that I tend to be interested in or passionate about and develop shows around and themes come from my own sort of like struggles, or what I might be dealing with, or things that I find worth investigating just in myself. And I kind of know that if I'm feeling, a certain way about something, or if I want to make a show around a certain theme, whether it be identity or politics or, body image or hair, or like all the other elements that sort of affect Black women in America, that there's art out there that will likely fall under the same theme. And hopefully made by a Black woman,
Right.
Sometimes that doesn't happen. And I think it's an agency that Black women and Black people in general in our culture possess, the sort of solitary ability to express our existence or our family or, whatever it is, through art. Craft, design, mm-hmm. and fine art is sort of in our legacy, because we've been, right. Certain things are not given to us. We weren't really able to record our family histories, to write down certain recipes, or how did, you know, such and such make a quilt this one way. Like, things are taught to us through craft and objects, and that works its way now into contemporary art. And so I feel a lot of women and the similarities that you are seeing between legacy artists and contemporary artists doesn't really reflect, you know, like, oh, we're still grappling with the same things, but that there are these universal themes that affect women, Black women, however you identify, and the overlap is a couple hundred years for those themes, right? And so we're still making work that might speak to something that, you know, Elizabeth Catlett was doing 50 years ago, like Olivette Ballard is doing now. And I find actually a lot of comfort in that. It's probably the main thing that attracts me to art history, separate from just like viewing fine art or curating. But really the passion that I have for art history is that knowledge that someone came before me and had the same thoughts that I have now, or maybe dealt with an issue in a creative way the same way that I would deal with it now. It kind of makes me feel like this is a tradition that I'm a part of. The fact that I can pick up those themes still however many years later and then relate to them. It's sort of like finding a home, you know, that like smells familiar or something. Like, it's like this feeling like, oh, okay, I was here before because I'm reflected like in this work. So I think it's important.
Wow. Those things. I think just you covering that too, like finding a home, just having an outlook of the world that a description of the world that describes your same sentiments is a really powerful thing. Something I've been doing, you know, as you know, I've just been working the show and sharing information about the works and interacting with the people who come in every day, and some of the students from George Washington University who just come in and out of the show. I've been just asking different questions, and, you know, I'll see people resonate with the works and say things like, oh, this reminds me of my mother, or, you know, this image is something I don't typically see of Black people, as far as them in positions of self-satisfaction and just being content with themselves and content with what they have going on. And, you know, another thing, too, is I've been asked the question by about 3 or 4 people, as a man, how can you curate this show about, you know, women artists? And my response is always, you know, I live with women every day. You know, I have conversations with women every day. I talk to women every day. I listen to women every day. And I genuinely think, you know, we have a lot to learn by, you know, taking on projects that involve our other selves.
Your identity.
Right. Our other selves are outside of our identity. As you put it, like, I think, like, I took on this project, you know, just kind of, you know, really being open to, I guess, since it's visual, you can't really say it's listening, but I'll say listening it is listening in a way, like really just listening to what these artists were saying. And I just heard the same voice, you know, coming from a lot of these works, and was able to just see that they were dealing with a lot of the same things. So I wouldn't say necessarily I can sympathize with a lot of the things, but I can empathize. So,
and I think it's probably a question that as a Black curator we face, you know, time and time again, because how many shows of Black art have there been that were curated, presented by white people? Right? And like reverse, how many times have, when I was studying in school, it was a Eurocentric education. And if I were to follow, you know, that trajectory and become a curator at a museum of European art, you know, or some American art, something like that, that's outside of my identity, but I'm still expected, like you said, to be able to empathize with the work and understand its value to the greater world culture, and also, you know, the cultures that the artist identifies with or intended the audience to be. And it's interesting too, because I have a friend, another curator, Holly Francis, who I don't know if you know her. She works in the Smithsonian, and she recently curated a show of all Black male artists, similar to how, not necessarily a legacy and contemporary, but Black male artists selecting another Black man who had a significant impact on their artistic career, maybe not necessarily an artist, but someone of value, and they did a portrait of that artist in the style, like their own style. And wow. I probably, you know, I don't know, but I doubt that anyone would say to her, how can you do this show of all Black men? You are not, you know, a Black man.
Right.
So I think sometimes it depends on the audience whether they can understand that art and interpretation can be done by anybody, right?
Right.
And that you have the ability, and you should, as a curator, at certain times, be objective and not necessarily see yourself in potentially every work or thing that you're doing, because it should be about the artist and highlighting the work, and about your ideas and your concepts and your perspective and how you contextualize the work and thread it together. And that's your curatorial point of view and focus, but it doesn't mean that you can't work with an artist who might, you know, like I said, be outside of that. And it's also something that I think Black artists throughout history have dealt with, this idea that, like, there's sort of the trope about an abstract Black artist and whether or not they're making Black art, because there's not a figurative expression of a Black person in the piece, or for some reason people aren't able to believe that abstract works could still speak to sociopolitical, economic, or whatever, and they absolutely do, and that's the intention of a lot of them. So there's so many misconceptions about who can show what and why, and like in what way too, and how as Black people we do have a lot to say with our art, and that it shouldn't be, you know, limited to just one visual expression, right? And I think contemporary artists are especially breaking through that barrier. So I wonder too, like, if that's something you're picking up on, like these legacy artists having, you know, sort of like a unified voice, even though they're very different as artists.
Right.
Because they're coming from a generation where it was kind of thought, okay, you're a Black artist, then your work should speak about being a Black person, and not just anything you want, right?
Now, another thing too is, you know, when you're interpreting art and you're creating, you know, content around works of art, whether that be labels or an article or a book, there's usually a layer of biography weaved into it. Yeah. So I think, in a way, that adds and exemplifies that, you know, or it creates a requirement for the curator to explain why this is Black art, because that social reality is going to be reflected in that artist's career, where the works could have been shown in that particular time, how people evaluated the work based on who made it and said, hey, you know, this doesn't have any figuration in it, so it's not really work we typically look for from Black artists. If you did something like this, it would be more commonplace and more acceptable, and we'd be able to easily peg that as this.
There's like couple examples, are like Alma Thomas, and her work, and not, you know, working consistently in the area, being, you know, a professor and making a significant impact on DC, and not really getting that recognition until being, in the Whitney and when she's a senior at that level.
Right.
Because her work to any other person doesn't translate to what they perceive, a white person, really, right? Or a white institution, to be reflective of like the Black experience. And so it's breaking through to just observing it as abstract art or contemporary art. And like Sam Gilliam, right? They didn't, like, it was like one of his really old cloths was in a fair a couple years ago, and a gallery assumed that he was like a 26-year-old white guy with the name Sam Gilliam. And then he 80 plus Black dude shows up who's been working for 60 years. And now he's like selling out shows and has a huge commercial success. So it's like, and then I think people now try to be more subversive and understand that, like, okay, there's a lens that people have on my work. And sometimes the Blackness of it, like you're saying, is not necessarily in the work, but the artists themselves and their career and what they've had to face. And that, I guess, for some people, like, isn't enough. I don't know.
It's kind of one of those things that, can't be ignored in documenting about the artist, because it does. I think it definitely shapes their trajectory and their path and how they navigate the art world. Another thing too is the assumption that, a work in abstraction isn't by a Black artist.
Or somehow biographical.
Or somehow biographical. I think that's another it's kind of complicated, and it can seem paradoxical at times. But life is complicated. Art is complicated. But the point I'm making is that artists have very particular aesthetic concerns too. Just purely as an artist.
Right.
Like just outside of their their day-to-day, it's certain things they might want to do with color or with figuration or with lines that are going to be expressed in their work, but their biography ties it back to a particular tradition of artist experiences. So and that's something too that I noticed through creating the through lines or discovering the through lines for this exhibition. It was just that say like a contemporary artist like Zoya Taylor. She's a Jamaican artist, and she has an image called Stay Woke, Stay Standing in the show. It's a large work on canvas. It's two girls standing side by side in like this vacuous space. It's really colorful. It's got a blue backdrop, an orange ground. And they're wearing these African textile type clothes that look really festive, but on their faces they look kind of stoic or sad and lost. And it's like they're playing this language game, this body language game, where one has open feet, one has closed feet, one has crossed arms, one has more open arms. One, her hair is in an up style, the other one's her hair is tied down. So it's like this dichotomy between the two figures, but it also leans towards like a simplistic joy in a way too. So it's an element of humor in the work. And like these are things that I think all artists are going to grapple with. How do I create works that have a duality and a complexity to them, and spark a dialogue and make people think about narrative, even though it's not a typical narrative work.
And I think like culturally for us as Black people, there are signifiers and symbols, and clues and hints and things that artists drop in their work that is really like meant just for us. And you can kind of pick up on those things, and that's bringing in the joy and the freedom and the expression to experiment and to speak specifically to certain people quietly, and I think that it also shows the training too, because in art history, like that's always like different movements or positions of a hand or a foot like denoted something of the person who's in the portrait.
Right.
So like when contemporary artists break away from a traditional structure to have their own aesthetic, and they can kind of play with that old style but bring in little things like kente cloth or whatever signifiers to us as Black people now to pick up on it. I think that's kind of the way that newer works are getting away with, you know, like these little, and it's also kind of like things that we've been doing for years too.
Right.
Like, you know, leaving little signals to people behind us to be like, this is kind of the path to follow, or like, you know,
Right.
And the art does that. I think of like Kehinde Wiley as like one example, like in his works, like when he'll put like a Tim on somebody's feet, or like a little symbol on the corner, and you know, and like in Levette Ballad, like in all of her assemblage, like I'm sure there's little, you know, tokens here, found objects, or like old photographs or things that draw in the audience member who's looking at it, but the artist is doing it because they know, okay, this is gonna resonate with somebody like in my culture, right? Because they may have had a similar, you know, whatever in their house growing up. So I think that artists are playing, and they're learning from the legacy artists and how they kind of were able to be a little cheeky, because we're always able to kind of get away with a little bit when we're like speaking to our own community, because the outside community isn't maybe hip yet to like what we're saying, what we're doing, so you can be a little subversive that way. And I see that in contemporary culture.
I think too, you know, when you think about, I'll distinguish this in two ways. Like, you might have like cultural products presented in a work. So just like physical, recognizable objects that you're familiar with, you know, that you might say, oh, this was in my grandmother's house growing up, or this is something that I thought about, or this is something that, you know, I've always had around and I'm very familiar with, and I'm familiar with what it does. And then on the other hand, you might have the actual culture, which is more of an untangible thing. It's more of like a behavior pattern.
Yeah.
It's a thought form. It's something you're thinking about. So like Elizabeth Catlett's work in the show, there's a sculpture titled A Face for Two Worlds.
Right.
And, you know, it's one face facing to the left and one face towards the right. And it's on the same head. And, you know, like I really see, you know, Du Bois's articulation of double consciousness in that work.
Yeah.
You know, and like the faces kind of look like it's the same face on both ends, and it's like the whole torn asunder concept. The whole like, how do I, you know, navigate this world like in one body, and I'm just trying to,
if I have to be more than one person,
I have to like adjust myself so much all the time and be more than one person. So.
Like now we know it as code switching. Right. You know, and then like Dunbar's, like we wear the mask. Like there's like that one sort of face that you have for outside for them, and then there's the face that you have for like your inside life, your family. And it differs in expression, the way you sound, movements, like all these things that we've had to adapt to in our society for just this like suppressed white supremacy. And exactly, to survive and to adjust ourselves. And then when you really know you're safe, you can switch. Breathe. Yeah, and you can breathe, and you can relax, and you can be yourself. But at sometimes even maybe that isn't really who you are.
Right. That's
you know,
true too.
It's a level of comfort. And I think in that example, right, like we know we're still dealing with that fundamental sort of like Black American problem. And we've updated it now to 2019. We have a different word for it. We sort of understand it now, but it still exists.
Right. You can just say code switching. You don't have to say, man, I was at work today and I was torn asunder.
Right. Because now we'll be like, what? But yeah, exactly. And then also that white people or just people, like Black people in America specifically, that's just like what I know the most history about, that they're also becoming aware of this like inner dichotomy and struggle and two-person life that we lead. And so you could say that now to like a white person at your job and they would actually understand,
right?
Potentially.
It's kind of in popular media now too.
Yeah.
And I think I actually want to credit visual artists too, because I've seen the work by Elizabeth Catlett. That's an older piece.
Yeah.
And that's a depiction of this concept that I don't think existed in, other forms of media at that point in time.
And that's like the ultimate power of art, I think, like of Black art, outside of storytelling, and expressing our history, but just like sheer documentation it comes across, because so often we are making work just as a response to our lives. Artists are. And as curators, we're developing shows in sort of the same reaction. And so it becomes sort of like like a relic of the past, but it's sort of like you can tell, okay, at this point is when this concept entered mass culture through this piece of art. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of cool.
And I think, just, by the nature of most visual art being static, it's easy to prove. It's easy to prove when this thing happened because it's always been that way.
Yeah.
And it's always going to be that way.
And we just have to work on breaking the canon and filling in those gaps for when they might have overlooked something produced by an artist of color.
Now, another thing too, something I always say, just kind of jokingly, but I'm dead serious. Black people are by nature great existential philosophers. We're always contemplating the world and our place in it daily. Every movie you watch, everywhere you walk, you're hearing conversations in the background, you're listening to the radio. You're constantly making these considerations, making adjustments, and, just kind of being in survival mode a lot of the time. And one thing I noticed in the works of these artists, and this is represented by a section in the show on self-conception and notions of freedom, is just simply being. Not being able to be so defensive all the time or be so offensive sometimes, and just simply just being yourself. So like taking the mask off and just having that opportunity to breathe. And that's also expressed in, say, like Zoya Taylor's work, which I described a moment ago. Like there does seem to be a slight element of conflict and a slight element of duality, but overall it's not a realist piece, but it's a very I think it's a very true to life depiction of us, if that makes sense. It's a very true to life depiction. It does represent a subtle conflict, but there are like humorous elements weaved into the work. Or you might have a work of, say, like Delita Martin, with just a calm-looking sitter having a portrait done.
Right.
So I think that's another great thing to consider. Like in works of art by African American artists. What are the figurative works, and self-representations that are devoid of all of the social conflicts. And I think those type of images, they speak to me in a way, like they give me a language for something that I don't really see in my own life every day.
Yeah. Well, for like as a black woman, your appearance physically is one of the most political battlegrounds
True.
ever. And so I do think that seeing a more ease reflected in art shows a progress in culture that women have been able to, not fully, but achieve more respectability of their body and be able to then express that in work and in whatever form they want without, fear of sexualization or harm. Like to be comfortable and confident to show just like a happy sitter, and to
Right.
not have that moment of like, oh my God, like, I'm at risk. And I think that, like you were saying earlier, like there's something, I'm no doctor, but I believe like, in passed down traumas.
Right.
And there's something chemically, I'm sure at this level, that comes along, with being a person of color, something in that
Right.
melanin that really just keys you into that core feeling of when, we were being chased and captured, and like there was a real unsafety just having a body of color,
Right.
man, woman, or child, so for art to be able to expand on what does the female figure look like, what does it represent, what is the mood, what's the context, what
Right.
is she wearing, what isn't she wearing, like to have more, not diversity is not like the right word, but just to have more of that in the contemporary works, like as you're seeing in your show, shows that those older legacy artists were working probably there, and then now we have artists who are actually like, there's that phrase like, such and such walked so you could run,
Right.
like they're these older legacy artists are probably dipping their toe into expressing some of these fears and things that they have in the work, like Catlet, with the double consciousness. And then you arrive 50 years later and there's contemporary works that reflect like that freedom and that joy. And I think of like Amy Sherald,
Right.
and there's a debate sometimes around her work because her work depicts black people, but her color scale is always on like a gray scale or something. So quite literally, like, the depiction is of almost like not anyone. Like nobody has like a gray skin tone, but
It
in the
abstracts
face,
it in a way.
it abstracts, the identity. But looking at that face, like that's a black person. You can tell. So she's been able to just like express identity, and then her figures are in these moments of joy or relaxation or idleness.
Right.
That historically in depictions of black people we haven't seen. It's usually in a harmful way. So she's able to like get to that level because there are people before her who kind of pushed the boundaries and then made it, because it's not easy to show a black woman chilling, right? Because that's not what people expect, because that's not been the historical narrative around depictions of black women. So it's like revolutionary, right, to show just the ease of it and the other side, the inside, the internal side, the when the mask is off side, like revealing that. Now I think maybe contemporary artists are not as concerned with confronting like the outward view that we have to give to the world. And they're really more concerned with who's on the inside and the internal, and expressing that side of us to the art world and letting them know, like, hey, there's more to us. We all look different. We sound different. We're shaped different. We make art differently. I mean, you have a show of how many women artists, and, you know, it's a variety of mediums and themes, you know, so like there's not a one way, and I think it's showing that.
You know, another thing too is when you think about it, I worked at an art gallery at the art museum at Clark Atlanta University as a student, and a woman walked through and made an observation. We had a display of works from the 1930s up until about the 1950s. It was roughly a 25-year period. But she walked through, and when she got to the door, she was about to leave the space, and she said, you know, I noticed just walking through this section, all of the people kind of looked sad, or they looked like they were thinking about something really heavy. And I think that really speaks to the mood of that era. Like, you know, you got the Great Depression. Yeah. And visually, you got a Great Depression.
Right.
But,
yeah.
I think now, you know, those depictions of self-satisfaction that you typically didn't see, you know, back, you know, from works of like the 1930s and the 40s. And I would even, you know, argue later than that, you didn't see a you know, like this slew of images of Black people self-satisfied. It's more of a contemporary thing.
Absolutely.
But it's, you know, but also it's really important. I think in a way, even you know, like as a person that collects art, just having these images, or a person that just, you know, frequents museums or frequents art events, you know, just having access to these as visuals brings the reality even closer.
Right, exactly. Yeah, because you resonate with that happiness, and then it brings you happiness. And I think it's important, like, showing just that, because it's becomes harmful if we don't show the other side and get to showing a full, just like, spectrum of who we are. And we're in a spot now artistically where we're able to confront that and change, like, what is the image of a Black woman. I think also too about, like, that historically, like you're saying, like, those were more depressed times,
right?
So of course, but those are also times where when you could sneak in the joy, like, it was all that much sweeter. And now we have more attention to being able to capture those moments and not have to sneak it in here and there, but like Black boy joy or Black girl magic. And I guess, like, social media in our generation is bringing more conversation around those self-assured moments,
right? And
everyday people,
right.
And just sharing that. And I think with photography, as an invention, like, as it gets more sort of universal, like, everyone, like, now we all have cameras in our phones, or some of us might even have an actual camera. More people are documenting themselves, and we'll have more representation of these joyful moments, or these regular moments that we can share. And we won't, when we look back on now in, like, you know, 30 years, if the planet survives, hopefully, we'll see, we won't have that same sort of sadness looking back on our history and thinking, damn, like, these people were really sad, because we'll have more to show that, right. Yeah, maybe we were sad, but we were also celebrating, and here's proof of that. And like I was saying, I feel like that's art's goal, really, even if they're not doing it intentionally, an artist, but like, you're capturing the sentiment of people at a certain time, or you're expressing that story from the past or hoping it into the future or whatever. And so that we can see it and be like, okay. And because it's like, yeah, it just gets sort of discouraging as a contemporary person when you look back at history and all you see is pain.
You know, another thing too, not to cut you off,
No,
but I've been just kind of milling over this question for a while, and I think just us having this conversation has kind of solved it in a way for me. Is, you know, you have a lot of contemporary Black artists that are dealing in, you know, like their immediate circumstances. They're dealing in figuration. They're dealing in a lot of portraiture, and a big part of that is not only filling gaps in collections, but filling gaps in all the art ever made ever.
right.
Like these types of images
Mm-hmm.
need to fill. They have a huge void to fill.
Mm-hmm.
So I think momentarily is a great thing for, you know, self-satisfaction to be grappled with and also presented.
And one of the things that, like, I commend your exhibition, because for those of us that are here now, like, it's really important to connect to this, like, legacy, and understand kind of like what those artists were, so you can identify the voids and the holes, and it kind of gives more purpose or direction for like contemporary artists now to kind of go through realizing like, okay, these women came before me and did this incredible work, and that gives me the confidence to move forward with my practice. You know, it makes me think. I was randomly on YouTube looking at footage from Oprah's Legends Ball in like 2004. I think she did this thing where she invited like legends and then youngins in different industries for
And the
just
visuals are
for,
important.
yeah, and just the sheer appreciation from the young people to the old people for like the festival's theme being a bridge, you know, and really being like the trailblazer or the first to do something, because
Right.
there are so many moments where, because of everything that we've been rejected, if we have one achievement, we might be the first person to do that.
Right.
So just acknowledging, like, you know, from a contemporary standpoint, like that, those past contributions, I think is important, because art, that's like the cycle.
And you know, and also in a way,
My
so I'm
final
gonna wrap up really quickly with a final comment. So in a way, with this exhibition, our image is our message, as told by Black women artists. You know, these legacy artists represented, you know, they serve as bridge builders for a lot of these, you know, concepts to be in conversation, you know, by artists, by you know, artists of today. So, you know, we definitely want you all to come and check out the show. It's put on by Black Art in America. I curated it, a special exhibition of works by women artists. It's a conversation between legacy and contemporary artists. And the show is titled Our Image is Our Message. It's in conjunction with the March on Washington Film Festival here in D.C. We'll be here in D.C. until Saturday at 7 p.m. So 1 p.m. to 10 p.m. today and tomorrow, Saturday from 1 p.m. to 7 p.m. You know, come check us out.